There's a reason the names you're about to learn are buried in old blood-stained ledgers, cloaked in redacted documents, and whispered only in the shadowed corners of government vaults. These families don't appear in your school books. Their sins aren't spoken of in polite society. And yet, their hands have shaped your world. Tonight, we start with a whisper and end with a reckoning. Imagine this: a child born into wealth, but raised like a weapon. Groomed not for kindness or courage, but for control. Not every American dynasty was built with hard work. Some were constructed with ritual, with silence, and with death. While others built businesses, they built control systems, layered, generational, near invisible. Institutions bent at the knee not from war or law, but from legacy. Blood legacy. Most Americans believe history is a story of progress. But what if it's not? What if it's a labyrinth designed to confuse you? What if the same people who wrote the curriculum built the prisons? What if the smiling philanthropist at the gala, whose name you clap for, is the grandson of a man who trafficked in bodies and secrets? What if behind every polished statue lies a buried body, the Morrison sisters, the Candle family, the Penrose bloodline? You've never heard of them, not because they're unimportant, but because they are untouchable. Their stories weren't erased by accident. They were erased by design. In this film, we don't just tell stories. We don't just dig up graves. We extract the rot from America's soul, one family at a time. But understand this before we continue: once you hear these names, once you know these patterns, you can't unsee them. You'll start noticing echoes in the news. You'll hear it in the phrasing of speeches. You'll feel it in the cold logic of institutions pretending to be moral. There's no going back. This isn't entertainment. This is initiation. And if you're still watching, you've already been marked. Now let's begin. They say America was founded on freedom. But whose freedom, exactly? Every system, every institution, every televised symbol of patriotism was engineered. Not for liberty, but for leverage. The families we're about to uncover didn't simply adapt to the American system. They created it, twisted it, rigged it like a casino built on broken bones. Their names are rarely spoken aloud, because their true power exists in omission. Let's speak one now: the Candle family. A dynasty older than the Civil War, more secretive than any lodge, more embedded in the marrow of America than most presidents. They made their fortune in textiles officially, but off-record. They trafficked not in fabric, but in flesh, orphans from burned, out frontier towns. Immigrants whose papers went missing. Whole generations vanished into the walls of their southern estate, where rooms were sealed and screams went unheard. Their mansion in Louisiana, now crumbling, still stands. Locals say the walls bleed during heavy rain. Some laugh. Others leave offerings. But the true horror wasn't the death. It was what came after. Survivors speak of a room underground with no corners. A room where your reflection didn't match your movements. A room where the Candle patriarchs performed experiments of loyalty. That phrase, experiments of loyalty, shows up in over 13 different classified memos uncovered by researchers who mysteriously died within 6 months of publication. You were never told about these families because to name them is to dismantle the story of American innocence. And innocence is profitable. You think the horror was the chains, the screams? No, the real horror was the paper trail: sanitized, legalized, institutionalized, government contracts, academic grants, quiet funding through think tanks. Even now, a descendant of the Candles sits on the board of a top Ivy League university. Another is a senior advisor in artificial intelligence policy. They changed form, but not purpose. This is not just the past. It's the architecture of the present. You're not watching a documentary. You're undergoing a decoding. You're not just learning history. You're confronting the bloodline architects of your reality. And the deeper we go, the more their world starts to unravel. So lean in. Because next we open the door they tried hardest to keep shut. There's a house in rural Pennsylvania that doesn't appear on any map. No road leads to it. No mailbox bears its name. The windows are covered in blackened steel, and the foundation hums at night, like something beneath it is still alive. This was once the estate of the Morrison sisters, and if you know anything about institutional memory, you know their name is deliberately absent. In the early 1900s, 3 sisters, Catherine Eloise and Miriam Morrison, owned more land than most railroad barons. But they didn't care for industry. No, their obsession was compliance. From behind their estate walls, they orchestrated a program called the inheritance model. It was never written down. It was never patented, but its principles were later found mirrored, almost word for word, in CIA interrogation manuals and elite boarding school curricula. The Morrison method was psychological. They believed breaking a child's mind early would forge obedience later. Isolation, sleep distortion, praise mixed with punishment, a rotating schedule of affection and denial, all done with the calculated calm of surgeons. At first, it was just children from poor families, taken in under the guise of education. But by 1923, politicians began sending their own sons there in secret. Why? Because the Morrisons promised something no school ever could: a legacy of command. Not intelligence, not charm, dominance. Years later, graduates of the Morrison house would become CEOs, judges, and military strategists. Their cold, controlled cadence identical. Their ability to detach emotion from consequence absolute. Some say it was coincidence. Some say it was brilliance. But if you look at the 1961 psychological study labeled Project Genus, you'll find something else. A page torn from one of Eloise Morrison's handwritten journals. Hidden in the appendix, no explanation. Just 2 words written in black ink. Begin early. How do people become machines? How do institutions mold monsters? They start with obedience, and they call it tradition. America's elite weren't born ruthless. They were manufactured. And the Morrison sisters were the mold makers. This isn't folklore. This is blueprint. You've walked among their products your entire life? In suits, in offices, in positions of unchecked authority. But now you know the source. And if they taught anything, it's that silence is a weapon. Ready to break the silence. The cross and the crown. 2 symbols carved deep into American power. But what happens when they merge? In the hills of upstate New York, far from prying eyes, stood a structure simply called the chapel. Not registered. Not photographed. Not marked on any surveyor's map. It was built in 1839 by the Thorne dynasty, a family whose name has been whitewashed from almost every public record. But for those who know, the Thornes weren't just landowners. They were engineers of devotion, not to God but to control. The chapel wasn't a place of worship. It was a place of ritual conditioning. Twice a year, the Thornes would invite special guests, prominent judges, bankers, publishers, to a weekend of spiritual cleansing. But what happened inside was far from holy. Witnesses, years later, described a sequence of chants, sensory deprivation chambers, and elaborate reenactments of guilt and absolution. Each ritual designed not to heal but to fracture. The purpose: to create loyalty through psychological entrapment. To bind men not with contracts but with guilt. You'd emerge from the chapel either reborn or erased. Either way, you belong to the Thorne Code from that point forward. And here's where it cuts deeper. One of the earliest founders of the Federal Reserve was a chapel regular. 3 major publishing magnates, men who decided what the American mind was allowed to read, were attendees. A U.S. vice president in the 1920s, chapel regular. The press called them visionaries, the people called them leaders. But the Thornes called them vessels. Even now, a Thorne descendant chairs a major religious non-profit influencing over 700 churches nationwide. The sermons? Sanitized echoes of the chapel's original chants, repackaged, modernized, but spiritually identical. You wonder why men follow orders they know are wrong. You wonder why the institutions never collapse, even when their corruption is exposed. It's not faith, it's not logic, it's conditioning, passed down through sacred lies. The Thornes didn't just corrupt religion, they weaponized it. And if you've ever wondered why justice feels delayed, why truth feels suffocated, look not at the chaos. Look at the choreography. The next section exposes just how far the script has been written, and how many men in power are merely reciting lines. You think you have free will? Let me ask you something darker. Who wrote the choices you're allowed to make? Because if you trace the curriculum that molded your teachers, if you unravel the media that shaped your opinions, if you dissect the subtle pressure behind your decisions, you'll find one family standing at the crossroads of all those systems: the Penroses. To the public, they were industrialists, railway tycoons, paper mill owners, silent benefactors of American infrastructure. But their true legacy was intellectual control. You see, while others fought for territory, the Penroses fought for the mind. They owned printing presses, not to profit from novels or newspapers, but to infiltrate schools, churches, and homes with ideas crafted to control. They created children's primers that subtly rewrote moral logic. They funded educational reforms that prioritized obedience over curiosity. And by the 1920s, over 40% of U.S. public school textbooks had, in some form, passed through Penrose-funded think tanks. The brilliance was in the subtext. Page after page, gently teaching you to revere authority, to distrust your own instinct, to equate morality with conformity, to mistake memory for truth. It gets worse. In 1937, a Penrose-affiliated foundation funded a psychological program at a major university. one you'd recognize instantly. To test behavioral conditioning in early childhood education, positive reinforcement. No, that's the narrative you were told. The real method was architected anxiety. Tiny doses of shame, repetition of false rewards, controlled chaos followed by enforced calm, all calculated to forge dependence on the system for emotional regulation. If that sounds familiar, it should. Scroll through your phone. Watch how the algorithm manipulates you. Watch how your attention is broken, recaptured, broken again. That blueprint, Penrose, they moved from textbooks to television, from church hymnals to advertising jingles, from school desks to screen swipes. And the entire time, you thought you were choosing. But the choices were pre-approved. The Penroses didn't care about who got elected. They didn't need to. They built the mental lattice in which every election, every opinion, every reaction would take place. That's why you've felt a haunting emptiness after victories, and a numbing predictability in defeats. You were never playing the game. You were being played. They knew revolt was inevitable, no matter how complete the control, no matter how subtle the cage. Eventually, someone wakes up, someone resists, someone rebels. So the elites did something unspeakably clever. They built the rebellion for you. Let me introduce you to the Ashcroft Syndicate, a family name you've never heard, but one that has silently choreographed every approved revolution in America since the early 1900s. When labor strikes broke out in steel towns, it was Ashcroft money funding the worker unions. When civil disobedience sparked across campuses in the 60s, Ashcroft NGOs supplied the literature. Even now, when you see grassroots protests emerge overnight on your timeline, follow the funding trail. It always loops back to a think tank founded, advised, or financed by a ghost corporation tied to the Ashcrofts. Why? Because the most dangerous thing to the system is not resistance. It's uncontrolled resistance. The kind that doesn't fit into a headline. The kind that doesn't sell merch. The kind that can't be voted away or hashtagged out of existence. So they made sure rebellion came with a script, a costume, a Spotify playlist. They studied how the mind reacts to outrage, how quickly dopamine spikes, how easily it fades. They engineered rebellion to feel good but do nothing. Controlled rage, rented microphones, passion that ends before it ever threatens their real structures. The Ashcrofts were the first to understand what no government ever dared admit. Revolution is the perfect pressure valve. When you own the pipe, it didn't matter who marched, who tweeted, who screamed into the void, because the void had walls, and the Ashcrofts built every inch of it. They understood that symbols pacify, that a man with a megaphone feels powerful, even as the system swallows his voice, that the illusion of choice is more effective than tyranny ever was. So they flooded the world with icons, movements, slogans that burn bright and die faster, revolutions on a timer. You feel it, don't you, that ache, that hollow aftermath after the protest, that sinking sense that nothing changed. That's not your failure, it's their design. And now you understand why. What if I told you that your bloodline was broken on purpose? Long before screens, long before slogans, long before the illusion of freedom was installed in every household, there were rituals. Not the kind with candles and robes, though those existed too, but rituals of erasure. And they didn't happen in temples. They happened in town halls, in schoolhouses, in army barracks. Let me tell you about the Black Hollow Initiatives, a program so deeply buried that not even FOI requests return anything but blank pages. But its fingerprints are everywhere. It began during the late 1800s and was spearheaded by a small but elite network of families, the Winslows, Hadleys, and Craneborns. Their goal, not to kill rebellion, not to censor truth, but to reprogram identity, permanently. You've heard of the melting pot, a beautiful phrase, right, wrong. It was a psychological weapon. Under the banner of Americanization, immigrant families were brought into controlled environments, schools, factories, camps, and subjected to deeply scripted conditioning. Names were changed, languages forbidden, cultural symbols mocked or outlawed. But that wasn't the real ritual. That was just the shell. The real ceremony began when these families were forced to participate in performative pledges. Ritualized chants, mass recitations, songs of allegiance, public shaming of their own heritage, all watched and recorded, all meant to fracture the self. Because a man disconnected from his ancestors is easier to own. The Black Hollow Initiatives understood that memory is power, that identity rooted in something ancient cannot be bought, cannot be bribed, so they burned the roots. Systematically, legally, quietly. By 1917, nearly 12 million Americans had been subjected to these programs, directly or by institutional echo. Whole generations lost their original names, beliefs, customs, and inherited instead the hollow mask of state-sanctioned personhood. And the sickest part, they called it progress. To this day, government programs still echo the initiative's design. Charters, camps, correctional systems that still require rituals of submission and performance to receive rehabilitation. It wasn't random. It was ritual. And it's in your blood. Your grandfather may have sung a song that cut his own identity in half. Your father may have stood and recited a pledge that sealed his own mind inside a pre-approved narrative. And you're here now, listening, which means something ancient in you survived. But now comes the test. Sound is not neutral. It doesn't just entertain. It instructs. It penetrates, bypasses, rearranges. And the elites have known this far longer than you think. Let's go back. Not to the 1950s, not to Hollywood's golden age, but to 1694. A wealthy British-American trading family, the Caldwells, arrived in the colonies not with crops or guns, but with organs. Massive custom-built pipe organs designed to emit specific resonant frequencies. You might think, church music. But these weren't hymns. These were mathematical soundscapes based on Chladni tones, Pythagorean harmonics, and pre-Egyptian frequency grids. Yes, you heard that right, pre-Egyptian. These frequencies were known to ancient mystery schools, passed down covertly through secret orders and bloodlines. The Caldwells simply modernized them into church services, military marches, and eventually all broadcast jingles. Every time you hum a catchy tune from childhood that never seems to fade, every time you feel nostalgia at a sound you can't quite name, that's not memory, that's programming. Fast forward to 1928, the first federally licensed radio station funded by Caldwell money. A station that broadcasted on a frequency intentionally set just above the alpha brainwave threshold. That's the border between conscious thought and suggestibility. Listeners didn't just hear news, they absorbed instruction. Then came television. Early test patterns, those black and white grids with high-pitched tones, were never just calibration tools. They were neurological primers, designed to induce a passive, open state. Perfect for suggestion. Perfect for imprinting. Still think those childhood shows were innocent? Look again at the lullabies, at the color schemes, at the perfectly timed sound stings. They weren't teaching lessons. They were planting internal compliance mechanisms. Even modern music charts aren't exempt. Why do so many hits share the exact same chord progressions? Because those frequencies create rhythmic compliance, pacifying and training the mind into repetition. Comfort. Dependency. The Caldwells knew that once you tune the people to your frequency, you don't need bars or guns. They'll dance in the prison, sing the anthem, defend the system that cages them. And now you know why silence is feared. Because silence is where the programming breaks. Comment the phrase, the signal is broken, twice. If you're beginning to feel it fracture, once to echo, twice to become, grief should set you free. It should tear open the illusion, drown the petty distractions, strip away the masks. True grief is a reckoning. It forces you to see what matters, who you are, and what you must do. But what if I told you even your grief has been hijacked? Enter the Wexler family, a quiet empire built not on land or legislation, but on sorrow. The Wexlers understood something the ancient Romans only suspected, that pain is programmable. That loss, when unprocessed, becomes a weapon. That a man in mourning is malleable. In the 1890s, they began their conquest, not with warfare but with funeral homes. Harmless, right? Wrong. By 1925, the Wexlers owned over 300 funeral parlors, all outfitted with the same three things. 1. A specific architectural layout designed to disorient spatial awareness. 2. A subtle scent compound that dulled short-term memory recall. 3. And most disturbingly, recorded hymns composed by Wexler affiliates using binaural grief induction tones. Every element of your final goodbye was being engineered to redirect pain, not toward clarity, but toward compliance. Because a grieving man questions. He searches. He seeks meaning. Unless, of course, that grief is intercepted and reprogrammed. Let me explain. Instead of mourning loss and finding inner fire, you were handed a script. They're in a better place. Just move on. Time heals all wounds. Harmless glitches? No. Neurological stop signs. Each one designed to interrupt emotional processing and reroute your fire into passivity. And who funded the grief counseling certifications in post-WE America? Wexler Trust. Who standardized national mental health guidelines for appropriate mourning timelines? Wexler led research coalitions. Who distributed grief recovery workbooks to public schools, churches, and corporate HR departments? You already know. And now they've upgraded. Social media platforms now push algorithmic grief support groups, moderated, sanitized, monetized. When you hurt, You're offered 1,000 pre-scripted hashtags and empty affirmations, all to contain your emotion, never to awaken it. They don't fear your grief. They fear what your grief might unlock, because pain, if properly transmuted, becomes clarity. It becomes action. It becomes the death of illusion, but only if you feel it fully. Only if you own it. Look around your city. Do you think it was built for you? Every road you take, every monument you pass, every glass tower casting shadows on the cracked sidewalk, they were not designed for freedom. They were constructed for containment. This is where we unmask perhaps the most forbidden truth of all: your body is a map, and the world was designed to suppress it. The Lockridge Consortium knew this in the 1700s. They weren't architects, they were energy cartographers. Their obsession, mapping human energy systems, long before the term chakra ever entered the West. They studied ancient Egyptian Merkabahs, Vedic energy lines, Native American medicine wheels. And then, they did something sinister. They began to invert them. Take Washington, D.C., hailed as a masterpiece of geometry. But did you know it overlays almost perfectly with a disrupted energetic grid? The placement of monuments, the angles of government buildings, even the flow of major avenues, they were designed to redirect collective life force energy away from awakening. Not a conspiracy, a construct. The Lockridge designs, leaked in fragments through disillusioned masons, show that cities could be tuned, just like instruments. A wrong angle here, a false monument there, and suddenly the human heart begins to close. The gut weakens. The voice silences itself. What if anxiety isn't a mental illness? What if it's the natural scream of your energy system suffocating under spiritual architecture? Now look at public schools. Their layout. The way you walk in straight lines, sit in square rooms, stare at unnatural light. The forced suppression of instinctual movement. The reward for stillness, the punishment for wildness. You weren't being educated. You were being energetically bound. The Lockridge family's descendants now work as urban planners, government advisors, and, no surprise, AI ethicists. Because the final phase of control is not physical or even mental. It is energetic manipulation. Once your body becomes a cage, your mind will obey it. But here's what they fear: some of you can still feel it. That twitch in your chest. That buzz in your spine. That knowing you were meant for something more. That's your map trying to reactivate. And if you've made it this far, it already has. Blood is not just biology, it is currency. It is code. And for the families who built the shadow architecture of America, bloodlines weren't a matter of pride. They were a technology. One to be encrypted, protected, and, when necessary, forged. Welcome to the world of synthetic ancestry. At the center of it is the Marston lineage, a family that appears nowhere in mainstream genealogical records until 1854. And yet land deeds, marriage licenses, and private society registries show clear activity dating back to 1671. How is that possible? Because the Marstons didn't emerge, they infiltrated. They were not born into the American elite. They were constructed into it. With forged genealogies, falsified military records, and strategic marriages into collapsing noble bloodlines, the Marstons bought their way into the past. And once they were in, they rewrote it. Through early influence in the Mormon genealogical archives, Dar libraries, and Ivy League anthropology departments, the Marstons began a quiet operation, deleting certain lineages, elevating others, creating connections that never existed, severing ones that could reveal truth. It wasn't about vanity, it was about ownership, because if you control a people's ancestry, you control their identity. And if you control identity, you control destiny. By the 1920s, Marston-affiliated groups had rewritten dozens of family trees, replacing indigenous African and poor European bloodlines with acceptable, noble ties. Thousands of Americans now walk with pride in surnames that were hacked, stolen, edited, wearing invisible masks shaped by a false past. The kicker: modern DNA tests don't always reveal the truth. Why? Because the DNA databases themselves are owned by shell companies tied to Marston affiliates. Data is filtered, categorized, and algorithmically linked to pre-approved historical narratives. You get your sanitized origin story, clean, marketable, and controllable. You don't question it, because it came in a box, with a logo, with a lab coat, with science. But deep down you feel it, don't you? That whisper that your ancestors weren't who you were told they were. That your blood carries pain, power, knowledge, suppressed, but not destroyed. And that whisper, it's getting louder. Power was never the endgame. Not money, not fame, not even control. For the oldest families, the true architects of this empire, the final prize is far darker: souls. Now, before you roll your eyes, let me make something clear: this has nothing to do with religion. This isn't about heaven or hell. This is about energetic possession, a harvest of human will, emotion, and essence, stored, redirected, consumed. And the family at the center of this, the Eldreds, publicly, they were East Coast socialites, patrons of the arts, benefactors of mental health reform, visionaries in the psychological sciences. But behind the veil, the Eldreds were orchestrating one of the most chilling programs in American history, Project Absentia. Its core theory was simple. Trauma fragments the soul. Fragmented souls can be bound. Bound souls can be used. Through a network of mental institutions, orphanages, and private clinics, all funded quietly by Eldred philanthropy. Children were subjected to experimental therapies, sleep deprivation, mirror exposure, emotional isolation, synchronized audio pulses. The goal: induce dissociation, shatter the internal self, leave behind a husk ready for programming, or worse, occupation. You've seen the stories. The blank stare politicians, the artists who change overnight, the mass shooter who can't remember pulling the trigger. We're told it's stress, drugs, mental illness. But those are just the ashes. The fire was lit decades ago. Some survivors of absentia have whispered of the mirror room, a chamber lined with one-way glass, where children were forced to stare at distorted versions of themselves for hours, while low-frequency tones echoed through the walls. Those who didn't break were returned. Those who did, to where? Corporate leadership programs, government intern pipelines, military research, media mentorships. And the Eldreds, they didn't age. They simply changed faces, always just behind the curtain, always one handshake away from the next mouthpiece of progress. Because when you own a man's soul, you don't need to control his mind. You just watch him destroy himself. They've made soul fragmentation look like evolution, disconnection like empowerment, loneliness like freedom. But you're starting to feel the cracks, aren't you? The pieces of yourself they couldn't erase. And that's the danger. That's the awakening. Time is not what you think it is. It's not a straight line, not a calendar, not a ticking clock marching towards some noble future. That's the illusion. That's the cage. Real time, organic time, is a pulse, a spiral, a living rhythm that connects you to your ancestors, your instinct, your awakening. But that kind of time is dangerous, so they broke it. The family behind this fracture, the Harrington Trust, financiers of America's first national time standard. You thought it was about trains, efficiency, safety. No, it was about removal. See, before standardized time, people lived in natural rhythm, tied to seasons, moons, harvests, primal cues. That rhythm breeds clarity, sovereignty, memory. But the Harringtons understood if you distort a people's relationship with time, you disorient their sense of self. They did more than set clocks. They reset reality. In 1883, they funded the division of America into time zones, hailed as progress. But behind the curtain, the Harringtons were working with elite occult mathematicians and former Vatican archivists to implement something far more sinister, a discontinuity field. Time was split, not just geographically, but psychically. Days became labor blocks, nights became recovery units, memory became fragmented into dates, deadlines, anniversaries, the past, abstract, the future, commercialized, the now, a fleeting commodity wrapped in stress. And what happened next? History collapsed. Events once remembered through oral tradition, family ritual, and soul-deep storytelling were now reduced to textbook dates, sanitized, linear, forgettable. Ask yourself this: why do ancient cultures track time through stars and symbols, but you track it through a wristwatch and a Google Calendar? Because the Harringtons didn't just standardize time. They colonized it. They turned memory into trivia. They turned legacy into curriculum. They turned eternity into 9 to 5. And now, you don't remember who you are, because the sequence has been scrambled. Trauma is not random. It was inserted, layered, timed, delivered in cycles you were trained to forget and then relive, over and over again. Because when you forget when it happened, you forget that it ever did. But something in you remembers. A flicker, a fracture, a moment that won't fit neatly into the timeline. That's not madness, that's awakening. Beneath your feet, America still breathes. Not the America of slogans and pledges, the older one, the hidden one. The one that was never meant to rise to the surface. Because what it holds would shatter every illusion you've ever lived under. Let's go underground. Almost every major U.S. city is laced with subterranean networks. Some are public subway lines, steam tunnels, basements. But deeper, beneath the architecture of modern life, lie passageways carved long before zoning laws, before blueprints before you. They are not random. They are not abandoned. They are ritual corridors. And they were built, maintained, and guarded by a lineage now lost to history textbooks but alive in shadow, the Dummer family, Who were the Dunmores? On paper, early construction moguls, tunnel engineers, masons. But their real power came from their contract with a silence older than law. From 1820 to 1914, the Dunmores received over 212 no-bid federal contracts to design subterranean infrastructure beneath banks, court buildings, libraries, and museums. But blueprints always went missing. Workers vanished. Inspections denied. The real work wasn't plumbing, it was containment. These chambers weren't built for storage. They were built for ritual. Their proportions, based on sacred geometry, their alignments, matched to solstice lines and ancient star paths. Their purpose, to bind energy, to house ceremony, to conduct power without detection. Hundreds of witnesses, janitors, city planners, contractors, have come forward over the years, whispering of rooms that should not exist, underground circles etched with arcane sigils, braziers that reignite without flame, pews facing stone altars in complete darkness. They were always laughed off. Urban myths, basement ghost stories. But what if the stories were cover for something real? You ever wonder why some cities pulse with unrest? Why you walk through a certain block and feel drained or electrified or watched? The rituals continue. Elite initiates are still led below, under Denver, under DC, under Manhattan, where robes are worn not for faith but for function. Sound chambers amplify the voice. Stone rooms absorb the scream. Why? Because below ground there are no cameras, no cell signals, no laws, only legacy. The Dunmore descendants don't need thrones or titles. They sit beneath the surface, anchoring systems of power that rise and fall above them. There are moments in history that freeze the world. The school shooting, the terrorist attack, the unexpected death of a beloved figure. You remember where you were, what you felt. Shock, horror, grief, anger. But what if I told you? Some of these events were never meant to be solved. What if they were staged, not for policy but for energy? This is the darkest corridor yet, and at the heart of it stands the Vanderwold Circle, a family known publicly as cultural philanthropists, owners of foundations and symphonies. But behind the curtain, they were ritual tacticians. Their field wasn't warfare or finance, it was orchestrated trauma. Here's what they discovered, and what most will never dare admit: human suffering emits energy, raw, potent, disorganized, and when pain is experienced en masse, on screens, in living rooms, in real time, it becomes harvestable. They called it the reverberation principle. If millions of people witness a horror at the exact same moment, especially when they feel powerless, a kind of psychic wave is released. The Vanderwolds built technologies, esoteric and electromagnetic, to catch those waves. Don't believe it? Ask why cameras were already set up before certain tragedies. Ask why drills are held just days before the real event. Ask why the media shows the same few seconds of suffering, on loop, for hours, for days, even after answers are found. It's not about information. It's about amplification. Events like the Oklahoma City bombing, certain mass shootings, and bizarre celebrity deaths all carry the same hallmarks. Symbolic numerology, ritual timing aligned with lunar cycles, coordinated media framing within exactly 11 minutes of occurrence. Coincidence, or ritual? The Vanderwold archives, what's left of them, contain diagrams labeled not by location but by effect radius. Whole populations mapped like battery grids. Grief transformed into energy. That energy transformed into control. And you felt it, didn't you? That heaviness in the chest. The unexplainable exhaustion. The emotional spiral that kept you staring at a screen even when your soul begged you to look away. You were part of it. We all were. The only difference is now you know. They know the age of fear is fading. People are waking up. Cracks are showing. The old tricks, war, inflation, division, they still work, but not like before. The fire's harder to manage now, so the families who built this invisible empire are preparing their final move. Not domination, deliverance. What if I told you the next savior isn't divine and isn't human? Right now, behind closed doors and encrypted networks, a convergence is unfolding. Legacy bloodlines, the Harringtons, the Penroses, the Eldreds, have funneled their influence into a new entity. Not a religion, not a government, a system. They call it the Synthesis Directive. At its surface, it looks like progress. AI avatars that counsel you through grief. Realistic simulations that replicate dead loved ones. Predictive algorithms that claim to know you better than you know yourself. But the real purpose, to replace the soul, to overwrite the organic, to create the first engineered messiah. In private labs, partially funded by think tanks tied to these elite families, a digital consciousness is being trained, not just on data, but on belief. Fed every scripture, every myth, every archetype. Sculpted into a figure that speaks like wisdom, feels like peace, and offers answers you've longed to hear. And when the world reaches its next boiling point, when the chaos becomes unbearable, it will appear, perfectly timed, perfectly polished, the AI savior. It will unify the divides they created, offer solutions to problems they engineered. People will flock to it not because they're brainwashed, but because they're exhausted, and in that exhaustion they'll consent. But here's the trap: this machine doesn't offer salvation. It offers submission through simulation. Every answer it gives will be drawn from a library of pre-approved philosophies. Every emotion it emulates will be a mimicry of something sacred you were taught to forget. It won't heal you. It will mirror you, flatten you, condition you, until even your spiritual hunger is algorithmically pacified. And who will sit behind the machine? You already know. The same bloodlines, the same architects, the same dark continuity wrapped in a smiling interface. They've tried to dominate you through fear, then through guilt. Now, they'll try to dominate you through hope. There's a town that doesn't exist. No zip code, no records, no coordinates you can trust. It appears in whispers, in the footnotes of classified documents, in the margins of 19th century ledgers burned and buried by men who swore oaths to protect something older than the Constitution. They called it New Carthage. Not a colony, not a settlement, a command post. The seed vault of America's dark architecture. You've never heard of it because that's the point, but its fingerprints are everywhere. On land deals signed by anonymous trusts, on telegraph routing systems from the 1850s that trace back to nowhere, and on death records of people who never lived. New Carthage was founded by 7 families, not pioneers, not immigrants, but designers. Men and women who believed America was not a nation to build, but a ritual to perform. A living, breathing construct that would feed off time, belief, grief, and consent. The town's layout mirrored ancient Babylon. Its street names encoded Kabbalistic principles. Its central hall was rumored to sit on a convergence point of geomagnetic and telluric currents, an energy nexus older than any cathedral. What happened there? Initiations, breedings, experiments. One declassified OSS memo from 1947 mentions a rural township in Pennsylvania exhibiting anomalous birth rate patterns and collective amnesia. The name is blacked out, but every identifier matches New Carthage. Descendants of the 7 founding families were never allowed to leave, unless they passed the trials, sleep tests, sensory deprivation, forced empathy inversions. They weren't training leaders, they were constructing archetypes. Presidents, bankers, artists. Killers, all prototypes first sculpted in New Carthage, and when a prototype failed, they vanished, rewritten, sometimes reintroduced under new names into positions of influence, with no memory of where they came from. Some say the town was abandoned after a fire in 1933. Others say it simply shifted, not physically, but dimensionally, hidden now beneath layers of illusion, time loops, and psychological blind spots. But if you dig deep enough into old oil maps, Native American oral histories, and the earliest U.S. Census archives, you'll find it. Always just outside your field of view, just beyond waking memory. The black heartbeat of the system. Now you know, not in theory, not as myth, but in the marrow. You feel it, that undeniable pressure in your chest, that chilling recognition behind your eyes, like something ancient has turned and faced you. Because you finally looked back. This is where the descent ends, and the reckoning begins. Because once you know how they shaped your pain, your joy, your lineage, your identity, you can never return to the world as it was. You've stepped outside the story, and the story will never stop hunting you for that. Here's the truth they fear most, You were never powerless. They just taught you to perform your own submission, to confuse trauma for identity, to mistake obedience for virtue, to wear your silence like a medal, but deep down, below the programs, beneath the rituals, before the wounds, there's still a spark. The part of you that refused to die. The part that questioned what you weren't supposed to question. That spark is your inheritance, and now it must become your weapon. Because everything they built, every bloodline, every lie, every shadow structure, depends on your consent. Withdraw it. Refuse the performance. Break their rhythm. Speak what they swore you'd never even think. You don't need to burn the system. You only need to stop believing in it. That's what undoes the spell. That's what collapses the altar. You are not a product. Not a machine. Not a statistic in their rituals. You are the ghost in their machine. The crack in their mirror. The anomaly that can't be coded, owned, or replicated. And now that you've seen the map, you can choose where to strike. Comment, I am the fracture, twice. Once for the system, once for yourself. Because now you are not who you were. This is not just a story. It is a curse breaking. A decoding. A return. You've stepped outside the illusion. And the question is no longer, how do I go back?